So you're taking the LSAT in 2024. The first thing we should do, of course, is consider whether you're taking the LSAT with the logic games or without the logic games section. For those who aren't aware, LSAT is removing the logic games section after the June 2024 LSAT and replacing it with a second scored logical reasoning section. So are you taking the LSAT in either April or June with the games section, or are you taking it in August and beyond without the logic games section? This will dictate what your LSAT study plan looks like. Regardless of when you're taking it though, I recommend following my 5-phase framework for designing any LSAT study plan. I call it the LASER approach to LSAT prep. LASER is an acronym standing for Learning, Accuracy, Sections, Exams, and Review. Again, LASER, Learning, Accuracy, Sections, Exams, and Review. The first phase is learning, where you are building a strong foundation, getting down the fundamentals of the LSAT, the different sections, and the different question types. So for logic games, this would include ordering games, grouping games, then combinations of both, then on to the more rare game types like pattern games, mapping games, circle games, and curveball games. Of course, start with the easiest, work your way up. For logical reasoning, which of course everybody's going to be taking, you have roughly 15 different types of questions. Some, of course, are more common than others. The most common are going to be inference questions, flaw questions, and necessary assumption questions. Now, if you're taking the LSAT in the next couple months, things remain as is, of course. However, if you're taking the LSAT after June, not only are they removing the game section, and not only are they adding in a second scored logical reasoning section, but we've gotten indications based on experimental sections of logical reasoning administered in the past few months that they're going to change the proportion of different question types in logical reasoning. We are seeing more questions involving formal logic, more questions involving numbers versus percentages. So diagramming conditional statements may be useful for some of these questions. And of course, this is likely in reaction to LSAC removing logic games. They want to test these concepts in the logical reasoning section instead, since of course they can't do it in the game section because there isn't going to be a game section. So consider this when designing your study plan. If you're taking the LSAT in August or beyond, that the logical reasoning section may not look exactly the same as it has up to this point. Of course, there will be no new bizarre question types, but rather a change in the relative proportions of different logical reasoning questions. I'd expect more inference questions involving formal logic, more sufficient assumption questions, and again, more methods of reasoning involving numbers and percentages, relative versus absolute, things of that nature. So again, you're doing the learning phase of LASER approach, learning, accuracy, sections, exams, and review. Just to reorient ourselves here, you're building the fundamentals, getting those down for each section, each question type. Then if you discover any particular weak areas on any section of the exam, you move into the accuracy phase. So you move away from reading LSAT textbooks, watching course lesson videos, into drilling questions by type. So for logic games, you'd be drilling ordering games, ordering game after ordering game, grouping game after grouping game. For logical reasoning, if you find that you're struggling with, for example, inference questions involving formal logic, maybe you're going to want to drill those, doing a bunch of those in a row, rather than jumping into sections with full length timed sections where you get the grab bag mix of different logical reasoning questions. Instead, you're working just on tons of strengthening questions, tons of necessary assumption questions, tons of flaw questions, for example. Then once you've got reasonably accurate, I'm saying roughly say maybe 70% or so, you're moving into the sections phase, the S in the LASER approach, where you're doing full timed sections to work on your pacing. With standard LSAT timing, that works out to 35 minutes per section. Of course, you may get more if you have extra time accommodations, but the standard is 35 minutes. Worth considering here that not every question is of equal difficulty, but all questions are worth the same. So you want to knock out your low-hanging fruit, the easiest questions first, build up a time bank that you can then apply to the more tougher questions later in the section. So the first 10 questions in logical reasoning, for example, are going to be your easiest ones, meaning that you work through those at a relatively faster pace. You then have more time for the tougher questions later in the section that truly need it. Once you've gotten pretty good with your accuracy and your pacing, you then move on to E for exams and endurance. This is where you're doing full-length timed practice tests, 4 sections back to back with only a 10-minute break between sections 2 and 3. You're going to have, before the August LSAT, before they change by removing the games, you're going to have 1 section of games, 1 section of reasoning, 1 section of reading comp, all scored. Then you have one unscored experimental section of either reasoning or reading comp. They're not testing out games because, of course, they're not going to be any more game sections after June, and they have enough in the bank. If you're taking the LSAT after June, of course, you're going to have 2 scored logical reasonings, 1 scored reading comp, and then 1 unscored extra section of either reasoning or reading comp, meaning you could potentially have 3 sections of logical reasoning back to back with only a short break in the middle. Crazy, I know, but that is a possibility. So get ready for whatever your worst case scenario is going to be. And finally, of course, we're pulling it all together with R for review, the last step of the laser approach to LSAT prep. Review is not just watching explanation videos or reading explanations on a forum. It's a whole lot more than that. We're talking about going in depth, analyzing the mistakes in your reasoning. So in logical reasoning, for example, was your mistake coming from the stimulus, the question stem, or the answer choices? If it was in the stimulus, where did you go wrong? Was it that you got confused about what was the conclusion? What was the evidence? Was it LSAC's failure to include key indicator words like for evidence and conclusion, or for sufficient and necessary conditions? Was it that they included annoying tricky words like unless, except, until, and without that require some manipulation in order to convert them into conditional statements? Was it unfamiliar wording in the question stem referring to a common question type that appeared difficult at first? Or was your mistake coming from the answer choices? Was it a tempting wrong answer? Was it an unappealing right answer? If the wrong answer choice was tempting, what about the choice made it tempting at first, and what ultimately makes it wrong upon reflection? If it was an unappealing right answer choice, what made it seem unappealing to you at first, and ultimately what makes it correct? So you have these traps of encouragement towards the wrong answer and traps of discouragement away from the right answer. And until you can figure out which tricks and traps you are uniquely prone to falling for, you won't be able to avoid making the same mistake again. And of course, that is the point of doing all these exams, is to learn from your mistakes through that review process. I've created an in-depth framework for this process called the Socratic Review Method. It's the cornerstone of my LSAT prep courses and my one-on-one coaching services. If you're interested in finding out more, you can check out the links below the video to book a call with me and my team. We'd be glad to help you out. And so again, this laser approach: learning, accuracy, sections, exams, and review. Review is too often neglected, but don't leave it to others' reasoning and explanations. Instead, engage in this process for yourself. You want to keep a mistake log or a wrong answer journal of some kind to write out your thought process for every question you get wrong or every question you have difficulty with, so that you can avoid making the same mistake again. Now, of course, there are only a few months left until the April and June LSATs. With the logic game section, you'll have a bit more time if you want to take the LSAT without the logic game section and do 2 sections of logical reasoning instead. The choice is yours. There is no right or wrong answer here. Law schools will not care which version of the LSAT you take. And the good thing to consider here is that you can still take the LSAT in August and apply at the very beginning of the cycle in the fall. So if you're taking the LSAT in April, consider how many full-length practice tests will you be able to do, and don't do the older ones at the expense of the newer ones. If you're taking the LSAT in June, of course, you have a bit more time, an additional 2 months. You could potentially do double the number of practice tests in the lead up to June. And if you want to take the LSAT in August or beyond, you'll have the whole summer to study, and you'll be able to do 20, 30, maybe even 40 LSAT practice tests, some untimed, some as individual sections, some of course as full-length time practice tests to work on your endurance. The choice is yours, but of course consider that the more time you have available to study, the more practice tests you'll be able to take, the more pattern recognition you'll be able to engage in regarding those methods of reasoning, especially the ones that give you trouble. So do consider that when you're deciding when you ultimately plan to take the LSAT. Anyway, folks, that's all for now. I hope you found the video helpful. If you did, please do me a favor and share it with someone who needs to see it. I don't do any advertising for the channel. I rely only on word of mouth to help get the word out. So your sharing this video really does make a difference. And in the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.